Pre-linguistic gestures. We have just discussed pre-linguistic communication, and the way in which pre-linguistic communication takes place is through pre-linguistic gestures. Now, these are the gestures that children use as a manner of communication or way of communication, which is perhaps the only way of communication prior to language production or prior to the use of language. Now, children rely or infants rely heavily on the use of pre-linguistic gestures, which include movement of hands, arms, or other parts of the body. Now, these gestures actually are there as bridging from pre-verbal communication to communication or speech production. So, we see infants using these gestures to communicate in terms of getting their desires fulfilled. There are two gestures or two types of gestures that come under these pre-linguistic gestures. One is Proto declarative gesture and another is pro-imperative gesture. Proto-declarative gesture is basically the use of index finger to pointing something which is of interest to a child, which is of importance to a child. And pro-imperative gesture is again a gesture which an infant or a child makes to have certain action to be done on the part of a caregiver. For example, the kind of gesture that he or she would make to convey a command, like I want to have a piece of cake, or maybe I want to have that bottle of milk. So, two types where you see the use of index finger, which is proto-declarative, and then pro-imperative, where certain command to be fulfilled. Their comprehension and production of gestures reveal a basic understanding of communication processes in terms of what particular objects they feel important and how they communicate to get a desired response from the caregivers. Now, under these gestures, we need to see some of the areas in terms of the development of communicative intent, that is the communicative intentions, and also the beginning of intentional communication moving to communicative competence, as well as the early comprehension. So let's see what the first point talks about. Now, under this, the major criteria to reveal intent is waiting, persistence, and development of alternative plans. For example, suppose an infant tugs at her parent's leg, waits for the parents to look down, and then points at a toy. The fact that the infant waited for the adult to pay attention suggests that the infant was operating on assumption that we first have to get an adult's attention and then we point out what we want. Now, the child's desires may be somewhat ambiguous, something which is not clear, but sometimes children merely want to point to an object that interests them and have the adult knowledge that this is an interesting object. Not basically just wanting it, but also just the interest. But if the adult does so, the child persists, then most adults would infer that the child wants to be given the toy. Caregivers make these inferences all the time. The mentioned criteria are an attempt to describe more systematically how we make these inferences. So when the adults look at waiting, persistence, all these things actually enable the caregivers or adults to form certain inferences to understand what the infants or children are trying to communicate. At about 8 months of age, infants become more purposeful in their behavior. They begin to show problem-solving behavior in which they experience a problem, wait, and then try to solve the problem. The interesting study was done by Piaget in 1952, and he described the behavior of his son, Laurent, in which the child was shown a bell that was partially covered by a cushion. So the child moved the cushion with one hand and then got hold of the bell with the other. The child appeared to have a goal in mind and combined two existing behaviors to achieve the goal. So it has been seen that by the month of 8 months old child would start showing the skills of problem solving or demonstrate problem solving behavior where he combines his goal with the action to achieve a particular goal. Beginning of intentional communication. Now they consist of two communicative acts, which is assertion. Assertion is, or you can call, declaratives, and the use of an object as a means of obtaining adult attention. The second is request or imperatives, that is the use of adults as mean to an end. Communicative competence and early comprehension. That when we talk about competence, it is knowing how to use gestures and words to show off objects, make assertions, make requests, and the like figure into the child's pre-linguistic gestures and early speech acts. Somewhat less information is available as far as this particular aspect is concerned, but what little information there is, it suggests that young children also use these communicatively based strategies for comprehension prior to developing full mastery of the various structures of their language. Children seem to comprehend language in a manner similar to how they produce it, with attentions given to concrete manipulation of objects in the immediate environment. The speech of children by the age of about 8 months is not well developed. They utilize gestures in flexible ways to communicate their needs to their caregivers, and their communicative knowledge influences how they interpret the speech of others.